Our next presenter is Lauren May. Lauren has over 10 years of experience interpreting North Carolina history at museums and historic sites, and is currently the site manager at the Vance Birthplace Historic Site in Weaverville, North Carolina. Since joining the staff at Vance in 2018, Lauren has worked alongside colleagues to broaden the interpretation of the site. In her latest role as assistant site manager, Lauren's responsibilities included crafting educational programs, caring for the site's artifact collection, planning special events, and creating social media content. As site manager, Lauren oversees the ongoing interpretive changes at the site while working to uncover and share the stories of the people connected to the land. Lauren has a bachelor's degree in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MA in public history from North Carolina State. Please welcome to the podium, Lauren May. The handy dandy projector.
Thank you. And the arrows I got. Okay, awesome. All right, so this presentation actually will kind of continue off of what we were just kind of hearing about, because this is the step from the archives and how we take that information and distribute it to folks like you. So, as mentioned, I'm Lauren May. I am the site manager at the Vance Birthplace, just up the road in Reems Creek, part of Weaverville. So I came here off the Parkway, which was lovely, except for the rain. Have any of you ever visited our site before? Perfect. I mean, this is kind of the crowd for it. But so we are one of 27 state historic sites in the North Carolina Historic Site System. We are the almost farthest west. Actually, Thomas Wolfe Memorial is farther west, even though it doesn't seem like it should be, in downtown Asheville. It was originally developed and founded in the 1960s as a shrine to Zebulon Vance, who is most famous for serving as governor of North Carolina during the Civil War, and who was born, shockingly, at the Vance Birthplace, which is why it is called that. So how many of you have heard of Zebulon Vance before? Right. So Zebulon Vance's legacy is something that has always been controversial, even during his own lifetime, but it is especially controversial today. So we have to deal with that as employees and historians at the Vance Birthplace. And actually, if you take the entire name of my site, it is the Governor Zebulon B. Vance Birthplace State Historic Site, which is very meaningful as it is targeting the specific part of Zebulon Vance's life and political career as what was to be interpreted originally at the founding in 1961, which, oh, it's not as grainy as I thought it was going to be. Okay, so this is a photograph from a newspaper article in 1961. May 13th is actually Zebulon Vance's birthday, so they chose the dedication day to be on his 131st birthday. And if you can see in the photo, actually I think it got cut out, but up towards the top is actually reenacting Confederate soldiers with a Confederate flag next to the American flag, and there were descendants of Vance here. So this is a very specific narrative that's being told already right at the founding of the site, and a very specific mission as a shrine to Zebulon Vance. However, as I keep going on in this talk, I'm not really going to be talking about Zebulon Vance ever again anymore, so you can rest easy. But it's important to understand the context of the site and its history to fully appreciate the work that staff has been doing, and not just recently. This has been a kind of a 20-year process of broadening the interpretation at our historic site to be more inclusive of all of the people who are connected to the land that the state has today there, which is about 6 acres. And so, for example, interpreters followed social history trends in the 1970s and 80s to begin focusing more on everyday life of the Vance family, and then fast forward to the 2000s, and staff had begun researching the enslaved people who labored on the plantation, which has helped us create new interpretive programs and exhibits in the last 5 years. But let me pause. What do I mean when I say interpretation here? Because this is where a lot of people get confused and think we're talking about language interpreting. So the National Association of Interpretation defines interpretation as a purposeful approach to communication that facilitates meaningful, relevant, and inclusive experiences that deepen understanding, broaden perspectives, and inspire engagement with the world around us. So in a historic site or museum setting, which is where I work, we practice historical interpretation, which means we bring visitors into a discussion of the past in order to create connections with the present and hopefully help shape the future, right? Because we don't all exist in a vacuum. We want to not just learn about the past, but figure out how we can make connections in our own lives and hopefully improve the lives of others. So this is the earlier years of the site to kind of contrast with where we're going. So very living history model. You can see chair caning, which was mentioned earlier. This is a Revolutionary War reenactment in I think it was around the bicentennial, which is when a lot of this living history stuff came back into the forefront of how people engaged with the past in a museum or historic site setting. But how has that shifted today? So this is what we do now, and I have a few slides of that, and I will just go over some of these images with you. So today we do still have some reenacting, but we typically use less of the standing in formation shooting guns model, which is happy for me because I don't like loud noises, but to a more inclusive living history. And so we have most of the labor that was going on at what is today the Vance Birthplace when it was a plantation was done by enslaved laborers, men, women, and children who were enslaved by the Vances to provide all of the labor on the farm. And so the main cook at the plantation was a woman named Leah Irwin, and she was an enslaved black woman. If you go back to earlier times at the site, all of the cooking would have been done by white reenactors. So this is one way we're trying to broaden and inclusive that narrative. We also have 2 theatrical programs each year that tell the stories of 2 different enslaved women. One is Leah again. That's the middle. Leah and the Rabbit is a puppet show that talks about emancipation while bringing in the stories and reclaiming the stories of Brer Rabbit. And so this was written by a former UNCA student, Michaela Wilson, who you can see doing the puppetry in the middle. And then we also have a Christmas program that talks about Venus, who was an enslaved woman who actually raised Zebulon Vance. She was his nanny. And that program engages with empathy and Zebulon Vance's legacy and the story of Venus, who we don't have any first-person documentation of, but we do have some physical written evidence of her story. So this is a way to kind of bring it to life without using that kind of traditional reenactor method. We also have traditional storytelling in October and kind of scary stories for the Halloween vibe. And then a Valentine's program where we actually do engage with Zebulon Vance's history, but in a romantic capacity rather than a military or political capacity. It's actually an exploration of the love letters exchanged between him and his first wife while they were courting. So you can come and use a quill pen, sign a letter. We also speak interpretation, right, to the public through educational programming, often with school children, but this one down here is me, you can probably tell. At the state capitol during the celebrations of the 19th Amendment's anniversary a few years ago. So we leave sometimes, like I did today, and bring that interpretation further out. We also have probably anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 school children who visit the site every school year. So that's one of the ways we engage and bring this interpretation out. And they also have exhibits, so there's written interpretation, right? There's lots of different ways we can distribute this information and engage with it with the public. And so here are our most recent exhibits. In 2016, before I joined the site, they redid the entire main exhibit about Zebulon Vance. I hope to take that further when we have funding, because it is still very Vance-centric. I would like to make it a little more inclusive, or a lot more inclusive if I get lots of funding. But we temper that with some other things. We've got an exhibit on Robert Vance, who is Zebulon Vance's older brother and is not quite as famous, but made similar impact on this area. So it's good to bring in those other stories, but it's even more important to bring in stories of people, marginalized stories. Again, often people of color, women, anyone whose stories have either been purposefully suppressed or forgotten because they haven't been engaged with as much. And one of the ways that we've done that is through an installation we installed in 2020. We call it our Juneteenth installation because we finished it just in time for Juneteenth. And it is this one on your left, my right. And it is, we didn't have a ton of funding again, so we made it ourselves with our support board's literal support. We sat on a back porch all masked up and painted all of these names. These are the 27 people whose names we know who were enslaved by the Vances from 1795 to 1865. And actually, since we've installed this, I've uncovered more names. So someday I want to add. And our division director wants to make this permanent somehow. So someday you may drive out and it won't be blue anymore. It'll be probably metal or something that won't deteriorate. So this is one of the big ways we wanted to engage with the conversations that were happening in 2020, right? A lot happened in 2020, especially that summer as those protests were going on and as we were all kind of grappling with this. This is how we handled and dealt with those emotions and how we wanted to make space for these stories that hadn't been told and that we'd been telling for a few years, but people didn't know we were telling. And it is a way to, Zebulon Vance's name is on everything, all of our promotional materials and the sign you get to. If you drive on the parkway, it says to the Vance Birthplace. Now there are physical representations of 27 more names who also were mostly born there. This is also the Hudson Vance birthplace, right? He was born in that same site. Or the Abram Vance birthplace. They just now have tangible links there. One of the names on the sign is the person I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk, which is Jim down there at the bottom. And Jim was a blacksmith. So he was likely born in the Reems Creek Valley sometime before 1825 and was brought to the Vance's drover stand in present-day Marshall in the mid-1830s. And the stand was a stop along the Buncombe Turnpike, which was a drover's road through Buncombe County. The Vances capitalized on the road's traffic by serving the travelers and their livestock. Actually, one year, David Vance, Zebulon's father, mentions feeding 90,000 hogs. That would have been almost a majority of the hogs that traveled through that fall, and I don't remember the year off the top of my head. So most of that traffic was stopping at their stand, buying food, sleeping, resting, eating, resupplying if needed. And one of the people that those travelers would have interacted with would have been Jim, who was the blacksmith. So any metal work that needed to be done, repairs, replacements of things, also within that small community of Lapland, which is now Marshall, would have been done by Jim, but he wouldn't have been paid for that labor. All of the money, if any was given, would have been directly going into the Vances' pockets. And the family as a whole was growing in wealth during this period. Blacksmithing was a skill that was highly valued, as I've just kind of described. So when David Vance died in 1844, his wife held an estate auction or estate sale of his property, which included 12 enslaved human beings, including Jim. And there's an advertisement that you see behind me describing him as, quote, a likely young man, a blacksmith. But if you've already read through all of the text, you'll see that Jim's name isn't listed here. So how do I know we're talking about Jim here? And that is because we have another record. This is the handwritten document that was taken during that sale, and it records Jim. He is the where you see the name John O. Roberts, Under that, it says Negro Man Jim. So that's him there. And then further over, $860. So Roberts purchased Jim for $860, which is more than double what the other man who was sold on the same day, Abe. You can see him listed right above Jim. So we can tell from this that Jim must have been the blacksmith. To give you an idea, $860 is close to $30,000 today, although we have had a lot of inflation, so keep that in mind. But for several years, this was all we knew about Jim and all we talked about when we talked about Jim's story. We did include Jim's stories on our guided tour. So when we get to the tool house with the anvil, we talk about Jim's experience on the auction block, or at least what we can extrapolate from Jim's experience on the auction block, why he was valued so highly and why blacksmithing as a trade was significant at the time. Then we had to keep going as we got to the next structure. And we talked about other people's experience at this estate sale. But I was doing research recently and wanted to see if I could figure out what happened to Jim after. So I started looking for records of John O. Roberts. And the Buncombe County Register of Deeds a few years ago digitized all the slave deeds they have in their collection, and it is very searchable. It's all online. You can look them all up, and you can see the scans of the documents. And there is a deed from John O. Roberts to J.W. Patton in 1 year after the sale in 1845 for a man named James. And his sale price at that point was $872. So this is likely our Jim. And then John O. Roberts purchased him as an investment and sold him to Patton for a profit of $12, which is $600-ish today. And you may recognize James Patton's name, Patton Avenue. Patton owned the Eagle Hotel in Asheville and was one of the largest slaveholders in Buncombe County at the time period, neck and neck with Woodfin. So Jim would have been relocated to the area around what is today Eagle Street, living in the community of enslaved people living behind the Eagle Hotel, and being the blacksmith for hotel guests, for all of the people living in the area, and again, to put money into James Patton's pockets at this time. That's the Eagle Hotel in the 1870s from Buncombe County Special Collections. So it was Asheville and Buncombe County and a lot of Western North Carolina as a whole. The main industry here has been tourism from almost the beginning, right? So the Buncombe Turnpike as a drover's road is completed around 1827, 1828. But even before that, people are traveling into the area for economic reasons, but also for the good air, the hot springs, the beauty, all of those things. And so Jim is a part of this larger story, this larger narrative of Asheville and Buncombe County as a tourist destination, and is part of the story of the Vance Birthplace, which is connected into that. And so what are we doing to interpret Jim's story now and his connection into this larger narrative of this place where we all live? We are putting in an exhibit. So on our property, we have a slave dwelling, or at least a structure that represents a slave dwelling. There's some iffiness on the cabin that's there, but it is a representation of a slave dwelling that would have potentially been at the Vance plantation in the 1790s to early 1800s. Right now, it is a building you can go in and see furnish, which you can see in that side, sort of. The only good picture I had was during an event where we had a fire lit, so it's kind of hard to see. We take you there on tour. It's actually the first stop on our tour. That's one of the changes we have made in the last 6 to 7 years, to invert that typical plantation narrative where you start at the big house and work your way down. On our tour, you start at the slave dwelling and work your way up to the Vance house. And actually, I don't really talk about the Vances that much. I talk about the people they enslaved and how they would have experienced life in the Reems Creek Valley. In June of 2025, if everything goes well, there will be a new exhibit in this space. So it'll be self-guided. You can go anytime you visit the site. You don't have to talk to me or any other humans. You can go into the slave dwelling and learn about the history of slavery in Western North Carolina, how it ties into this tourist narrative, how it ties into the environment, how it ties into these family stories of Western North Carolina, predominantly Buncombe County. But also how individuals like Jim fit into this story. So there will be a panel on Jim, more concisely telling you all of the things I just told you today. And his story will be there for people to see. There will be artifacts. We don't have any, unfortunately, associated with any enslaved people specifically at our site, but artifacts that are similar to ones they would have used. And so that is all I have for you, I believe.